The world only saw the fairy tale Isabella Beaumont, the graceful wife of billionaire industrialist Julian Beaumont, pregnant with the heir to a vast fortune. But when Julian's helicopter vanished from the sky, Isabella's perfect world didn't just crack, it exploded. At his funeral, a beautiful stranger named Sophia Laurent stepped out of the shadows, a hand resting on her own swollen belly, and declared herself the true keeper of Julian's heart. Now these two pregnant women, a wife and a mistress, are on a collision course heading for a will reading that will expose a web of secrets so dark it will either destroy them both or reveal a final shocking truth that no one saw coming. Life inside the Beaumont estate in Greenwich, Connecticut was a masterpiece of curated perfection. From the outside, it was a sprawling stone manor, its ivy-clad walls guarding acres of manicured lawns that rolled down to the serene waters of the Long Island Sound. For Isabella Beaumont, it had been a dream then, a home, and now increasingly a beautiful silent cage. She traced the rim of her porcelain teacup, the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the solarium. The gardens were in full bloom, a riot of color meticulously planned by a team of landscape artists. Yet the beauty felt distant, like a painting she could admire but never touch. At 7 months pregnant, Isabella should have been basking in the glow of impending motherhood. Instead, a persistent chill had settled deep in her bones, one that had nothing to do with the central air conditioning. Her husband, Julian Beaumont, was a force of nature, a titan of industry who had inherited a respectable manufacturing firm from his father and with ruthless genius transformed it into Beaumont Global, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate with interests in tech, energy, and aerospace. He was brilliant, impossibly handsome, with his sharp jawline and intense steel-gray eyes, and moved through the world with an unnerving confidence that bordered on arrogance. When they met, she was an art history curator at the Met, passionate and full of life. He'd been a whirlwind romance, private jets to Paris for dinner, shutting down Tiffany & Co. for a private shopping experience, a proposal under the northern lights in a glass igloo in Finland. He had painted a world for her, and she had stepped into it willingly. But the whirlwind had long since settled into a predictable and often lonely routine. Julian's business trips became more frequent, his nights at the office longer. The passion that had once defined them was replaced by a polite, courteous distance. He was a good provider, a respectable husband in the eyes of their elite social circle, but the emotional intimacy had evaporated, leaving a void that Isabella filled by focusing on her pregnancy, their legacy project, as Julian had once called it, in a moment of detached planning. She placed a hand on her burgeoning stomach, feeling the gentle flutter of the life within her. This child, a son they already knew, was her anchor. He was the future, the tangible proof of their union, the one thing she was sure was real in a life that felt increasingly like a performance. The phone rang, its shrill tone shattering the morning's fragile peace. It was Mr. Alistair Finch, Julian's longtime attorney and friend. His voice, usually so measured and calm, was strained. "Isabella," he began, and the absence of his usual pleasantries sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. "There's been an incident. It's Julian's helicopter." The world tilted on its axis. "An incident? What kind of incident?" she asked, her voice a reedy whisper. "It lost contact with air traffic control an hour ago. It was flying over the Rockies en route to a site inspection in Colorado. The weather turned unexpectedly. Search and rescue is on site, but—" "Isabella, the initial reports are not good." The teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was deafening in the silence that followed. She didn't hear Alistair's attempts to soothe her, didn't register the housekeeper rushing in. All she could see was Julian's face that morning, kissing her on the cheek with the same cool efficiency he applied to signing a business deal. For the heir, he'd said a rare small smile touching his lips as he glanced at her stomach before turning and walking out the door, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous foyer. For the next 8 hours, Isabella existed in a state of suspended animation. News reports flickered on the massive television in the living room, images of a remote snow-dusted mountain pass. Twisted metal wreckage barely visible through the trees. Somber-faced reporters speaking in hushed tones. The official confirmation came just before dusk. There were no survivors. Julian Beaumont, the indomitable Titan, was gone. The grief was a physical blow, a brutal hollow ache that stole her breath. Despite the distance that had grown between them, he was her husband, the father of her unborn child. He was the architect of her entire world. And in an instant, that architect and the world he had built had been obliterated. As the news spread, the phones began to ring incessantly, a deluge of condolences from friends, business associates, and people she barely knew. Each call was a fresh wave of pain, a reminder of the public role she now had to play, the grieving billionaire's widow. Little did she know the most brutal performance of her life was yet to come, and she was about to be thrust onto a stage she never could have imagined. The cage was broken, but what lay outside was not freedom, but a storm of unimaginable chaos. The day of Julian's funeral was a somber spectacle, a perfect reflection of his life, grand, impeccably organized, and emotionally sterile. A line of black town cars snaked its way to the historic St. James's Church on Madison Avenue. The pews were filled with the titans of Wall Street political dignitaries and the upper echelon of New York society, all gathered to pay their respects to a man more feared and admired than loved. Isabella, veiled in black Dior, was the very picture of tragic grace. Supported by her younger brother Ethan, she moved through the suffocating sea of condolences like a ghost. Every, "I'm so sorry for your loss," and "he was a great man," felt like a paper cut, a small sharp sting, against her already raw grief. Her pregnancy was a conspicuous round focal point beneath her mourning dress, a silent testament to the future that had been stolen. The service was impersonal eulogies, focused on Julian's business acumen, his ruthless vision, his philanthropic donations, that were more about tax strategy than genuine charity. No one spoke of Julian, the man, the husband, the father-to-be. Perhaps Isabella thought with a pang of sorrow no one really knew him. It was at the graveside service under a sky the color of slate that the curated perfection of the day was irrevocably shattered. As the final prayer was being said, a woman stepped forward from the periphery of the crowd. She was stunningly beautiful, with raven black hair cascading over the shoulders of a fitted black dress that was just as stylish as Isabella's, but somehow more audacious. Her face, a mask of carefully constructed sorrow, was punctuated by startlingly green eyes. And to Isabella's utter horror, she was also visibly pregnant, her condition just as advanced as her own. A collective silent gasp rippled through the assembled mourners. Who was this woman? She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, stopping just a few feet from the casket. She placed a single white rose on the polished mahogany, her movements theatrical and self-aware. Then she turned her emerald eyes, locking onto Isabella's. "He loved me," the woman said, her voice just loud enough to carry on the cold air, a crystalline sound laced with defiance. "He was coming home to me. To us." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. Ethan's hand tightened on her arm, a steadying anchor in a suddenly churning sea. "Isabella, don't," he murmured, his voice low and urgent. But the woman, who seemed to thrive on the attention of the horrified crowd, took another step closer. "My name is Sophia Laurent," she announced, her gaze sweeping over the mourners before returning to Isabella. "Julian and I were going to build a life together. I'm carrying his child, his son." The implication was a poisoned dagger aimed directly at Isabella's heart. His son, as if the child Isabella carried was somehow less legitimate, a mere placeholder. The public humiliation was suffocating. Whispers erupted like wildfire through the crowd. Cameras held by the press, who were kept at a respectable distance, began to click furiously, zooming in on the unfolding drama. Alistair Finch, his face a thunderous mask of propriety, stepped forward. "Ms. Laurent, this is neither the time nor the place." Sophia gave a tearful, dismissive wave of her hand. "The time and place were stolen from me," she retorted, her voice breaking with practiced sorrow. "I won't be erased. I am a part of his legacy. Our child is his legacy. Isabella stood frozen, the world narrowing to the beautiful, smug face of the other woman. Every business trip, every late night, every moment of emotional distance suddenly snapped into a new, horrific context. It wasn't just work. It was her. Sophia. The name felt alien and venomous on her tongue. How long? How could she not have known? The question swirled in her mind, a nauseating vortex of betrayal. Ethan, ever the protector, moved to stand between Isabella and Sophia. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Now." Sophia held his gaze for a beat, a flicker of triumph in her eyes before allowing her face to crumple back into a mask of the wronged woman. She cast one last lingering look at Julian's casket, then turned and walked away, her departure as dramatic as her arrival, leaving a trail of chaos and speculation in her wake. The rest of the funeral was a blur. Isabella was escorted back to the car, insulated from the voracious stares and hushed conversations by Ethan's protective presence. The ride back to the silent, empty mansion in Greenwich was a journey into a new reality. The grief for her husband was now hopelessly entangled with the gut-wrenching pain of his betrayal. Later that evening, Alistair Finch arrived, his expression grim. He sat opposite Isabella in the vast, cold living room, a leather-bound briefcase resting on his lap. "Isabella, I am profoundly sorry for what happened today." He began his formality, a thin veil over his discomfort. "It was unconscionable." Was it true? Alistair, Isabella's voice was hollow. This woman, Sophia, was he with her? Alistair hesitated, choosing his words with legal precision. Julian was a private man. There are aspects of his life he did not share with me. It was a non-answer, and yet it was all the confirmation she needed. "What happens now?" she asked, wrapping her arms around her belly, a primal instinct to protect her child from the fallout. "Now we wait," Alistair said, his gaze steady. "Julian's will is to be read in my office in 2 weeks' time. He was very specific about the timing and attendees. A formal notice will be sent to you." He paused, then added with a note of warning, "And I'm afraid to Ms. Laurent as well." The room grew colder. Julian had included his mistress in his will reading. The betrayal wasn't just a secret affair. It was a documented one. Isabella felt a terrifying premonition creep over her. The battle for Julian Beaumont's legacy had just begun, and the serpent was already in the garden. The 2 weeks leading up to the will reading were a form of psychological torture for Isabella. The Greenwich mansion, once a symbol of her status, now felt like a mausoleum, its silent halls echoing with unspoken questions and the ghosts of 1,000 lies. She'd wake up in the middle of the night in the cold, empty, king-sized bed, her mind racing, replaying every moment of the past few years, searching for signs she had missed. Had she been naive, willfully blind, or was Julian simply that masterful a deceiver? The media had a field day with the funeral spectacle. Sophia Laurent was splashed across the pages of tabloids and gossip websites, portrayed as the tragic secret lover. She gave a single carefully worded interview to a prominent magazine, painting a picture of a profound love affair of a man trapped in a passionless marriage of convenience. She spoke of their shared dreams, their plans for the future, and their unborn son, whom she claimed Julian had already named Julian Jr. Every word was a calculated strike designed to undermine Isabella's position and legitimize her own. Sophia was also making moves. Isabella learned through a distraught household manager that Sophia had moved into Julian's private penthouse on Park Avenue, a property Isabella hadn't even known he'd kept. She was seen being chauffeured in one of Julian's reserve cars, dining at his favorite restaurants, and meeting with Beaumont global executives, projecting an aura of authority as if she were already the new matriarch of the Beaumont empire. Isabella's brother Ethan was her rock. A former investigative journalist turned private security consultant, he was practical, cynical, and fiercely loyal. He moved into one of the guest wings of the mansion, refusing to leave his sister's side. "This whole thing stinks, Izzy," he said one evening, scrolling through his laptop at the massive kitchen island. This Sophia Laurent character just appeared out of thin air. There's no social media history before 2 years ago, no family to speak of. It's like she was created in a lab to be a billionaire's mistress. She's pregnant, Ethan. Isabella said, her voice weary. That part is real. I saw her. She's as pregnant as I am. Pregnancy can be faked, or the circumstances can be misrepresented, Ethan countered, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Alistair said the will reading is in 3 days. I don't have time to do a deep dive, but I'm telling you, my gut is screaming that something is off. Julian was a bastard, we all knew that. But he was a meticulous, calculating bastard. This public drama doesn't feel like his style. It's sloppy. Isabella wanted to believe him, but the evidence of her husband's betrayal was overwhelming. She had found receipts from florists she didn't use, credit card statements with charges for jewelry. She had never received flight manifests for 2 to destinations he had supposedly visited alone. The affair was real. The only question that remained was its depth. Was Sophia a passing fancy, or had she truly captured the heart of a man Isabella realized she may have never truly known? On the eve of the will reading, Isabella found herself in the nursery. The room was a sanctuary of soft blues and creams, a custom-built crib standing in the center, a mobile of handcrafted wooden planets hanging above it. Julian had overseen its design with the same detached precision he applied to a corporate boardroom, but he had approved every detail. He had wanted this child, or had he simply wanted an heir? A wave of fear, cold and sharp, washed over her. What if Sophia was right? What if Julian had planned to leave her for this other woman, this other family? A life as a single mother was one thing. A life cast aside, disinherited, and publicly shamed was another entirely. The Beaumont name and fortune were the only security she could offer her son now, and the thought of it being snatched away by a usurper was terrifying. She picked up a small silver rattle from the changing table, a family heirloom from her own side of the family. Its weight was cool and solid in her palm. Her own legacy felt so small, so fragile compared to the colossal Beaumont empire. Whatever happens tomorrow, she whispered to the silent room, her voice trembling slightly, I will protect you. I promise. That same night, across the city, in the sleek, minimalist penthouse overlooking Central Park, Sophia Laurent was a picture of serene confidence. She hosted a small dinner for a handful of Julian's more opportunistic business associates, men who were already calculating how to align themselves with the new power structure. She spoke of Julian's vision using the we pronoun with practiced ease. We always felt that the company needed a more aggressive approach in the Asian markets. She'd say, her hand resting proprietorially on her stomach. Her closest confidant, a sharp-tongued socialite named Genevieve, cornered her by the window after the other guests had left. You're playing a dangerous game, Sophia Genevieve warned, sipping her champagne. The grieving widow is a powerful archetype, and she's actually pregnant. Sophia smiled, a slow, predatory curving of her lips. She looked down at the glittering city below. The grieving widow is yesterday's news. The world loves a love story, darling, and ours is the stuff of legends, a love so powerful it couldn't be contained by a meaningless marriage. She turned, her green eyes glinting in the low light. Besides, I have the ultimate trump card. Julian made sure of it. Tomorrow isn't a reading, it's a coronation. Isabella Beaumont is about to find out that she was never the queen. She was just the placeholder. Her confidence was absolute, her victory seemingly assured. As the sun set on the eve of reckoning, 2 pregnant women, worlds apart, prepared for a battle that would determine not just their futures, but the fate of an entire empire. The law offices of Finch, Covington, and Stowe occupied the top 3 floors of a skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, a bastion of old money and ruthless corporate law. The boardroom where the will was to be read was a study in intimidating luxury. A long, polished mahogany table, high-backed leather chairs, and a panoramic view of the city that seemed to declare its own power. Isabella arrived with Ethan, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She was dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue maternity dress, her bearing poised and dignified, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within her. Sophia Laurent was already there. She was seated at the head of the table opposite the executor's chair, as if it were her rightful place. She wore a striking emerald green dress that accentuated her pregnancy, and her eyes a bold statement of life and victory in a room heavy with the weight of death. She offered Isabella a small pitying smile that didn't reach her eyes. The only other person present was Alistair Finch. He sat at the head of the table, the last will and testament of Julian Beaumont in a sealed leather portfolio before him. His face was impassive, betraying no hint of the bombshells he was about to detonate. "Thank you both for coming," Alistair began, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "We are here today to execute the last will and testament of my client and friend, Julian Beaumont. The document was drafted and signed 3 months ago and is to my knowledge his final and definitive statement of his wishes." Isabella's breath hitched. 3 months ago. That was after she had told Julian she was pregnant. It meant that every decision recorded in this document was made with the full knowledge of his unborn son with her. Alistair broke the seal and opened the portfolio. He cleared his throat and began to read. The preamble was standard legal jargon establishing Julian's identity and sound state of mind. Then came the smaller bequests, donations to his alma mater, gifts to distant relatives, a generous severance for his personal staff. Isabella listened, her hands clenched in her lap, waiting for the axe to fall. "Regarding my personal effects," Alistair read, his voice a steady monotone. "My watch collection, art pieces housed in the Greenwich residence, and classic automobiles are to be placed in a trust for my son, to be born of my wife, Isabella Beaumont, and to be granted to him on his 25th birthday. A small victory. A flicker of hope." Her son was acknowledged. Sophia shifted in her chair, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face, but her confident smirk remained. She was waiting for the main event. "Now," Alistair said, pausing for effect as he turned a page, "we come to the primary assets of the estate." The room felt airless. "To my wife, Isabella Beaumont," Alistair continued, "I bequeath the sum of $5 million tax-free. I also leave her sole ownership of the seaside cottage in Montauk, where we spent our first weekend together, along with all its contents. I trust this will provide her with a comfortable and secure future." Isabella felt the words like a physical blow. $5 million. To the world, a fortune. In the context of the Beaumont empire, it was pocket change, a severance package. The Montauk cottage was a sentimental, almost cruel gesture, a reminder of a love that had long since died. She was being dismissed, paid off like a former employee. Ethan reached under the table and squeezed her hand, his knuckles white. Sophia, however, did not gloat. She looked almost disappointed, as if she expected Isabella to get even less. Her focus was absolute, waiting for her own name. Alistair took a deep breath before reading the next clause, the one that would change everything. "All remaining assets, including my primary residence in Greenwich, Connecticut, my penthouse apartment on Park Avenue, my complete portfolio of stocks, bonds, and private equity investments, and most importantly, my 75% controlling interest in Beaumont Global and all its subsidiary companies, I bequeath in their entirety to a single trust." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. This was it. The entire empire. Billions of dollars and immense global power, all held within one trust. This trust, Alistair read, his eyes fixed on the page, shall be known as the Laurent Beaumont Legacy Trust. Its sole beneficiaries are to be Ms. Sophia Laurent, and my unborn child to be born of her. The silence that followed was deafening. It was an utter and complete devastation. Julian had not just chosen his mistress. He had handed her his entire world, his life's work, his legacy. He had effectively erased Isabella and her son from the dynasty he had built. Sophia let out a soft, theatrical sigh, a single tear tracing a perfect path down her cheek. She looked at Isabella, her expression a flawless blend of sorrow and triumph. "I'm sorry, Isabella," she said, her voice soft. "I never wanted to hurt you. This was always just about love." his love for me and for our son. Isabella felt nothing but a vast icy numbness. She was a fool, a naive, trusting fool who had been living in a beautifully constructed lie. Her marriage, her life, her future, all of it had been a sham. Ethan began to rise from his chair, his face contorted with rage. This is a disgrace. He couldn't have been in his right mind. Ethan, please. Isabella whispered, her voice barely audible. There was nothing to be done. The words were there in black and white. It was over. Alistair Finch held up a hand. Mr. Thorne, please. I am not finished. Sophia's triumphant expression faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of confusion. Isabella looked at the lawyer, her eyes hollow and blank. What more could there possibly be? What further humiliation could Julian have possibly devised? There are, Alistair said, his voice taking on a new, harder edge. Several codicils and binding stipulations attached to the formation and execution of the Laurent Beaumont Legacy Trust. They are non-negotiable and absolute. He turned to the next page, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from one of settled tragedy to a sharp, sudden uncertainty. The game, it seemed, was not yet over. Alistair Finch adjusted his glasses, his demeanor shifting from that of a dispassionate reader to a surgeon preparing for a delicate and critical incision. The air in the boardroom crackled with renewed tension. Sophia's victorious composure was replaced by a wary stillness, while Isabella looked on with detached curiosity, believing there was no further pain that could be inflicted. Let us proceed to the stipulations governing the Laurent Beaumont Legacy Trust, Alistair announced, his voice echoing slightly in the silent room. Stipulation 1. He cleared his throat. The primary condition for the activation and funding of this trust rests upon the confirmation of paternity for the child of Ms. Sophia Laurent. Within 24 hours of the child's birth, a court-admissible DNA sample must be collected by a medically certified third party appointed by the executor of my estate. This sample will be compared against my own DNA, which is on file with this firm. Should the results confirm, with a 99.9% or greater certainty, that I am the biological father, the trust will be immediately and irrevocably funded. Sophia's confident smile returned, though it was a little tighter this time. Of course, she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. A formality. Julian was always so thorough. Indeed, Alistair said, his expression unreadable. Which brings us to stipulation 2. In the event that the DNA test proves I am not the biological father, the Laurent Beaumont Legacy Trust will be declared null and void. Ms. Sophia Laurent will be permanently and completely disinherited from my estate, forfeiting any and all claims. She will receive nothing. Sophia's face paled slightly. That's aggressive, she murmured, her bravado faltering. But irrelevant. It's Julian's child. Isabella watched the exchange, a tiny, unfamiliar spark igniting in the cold emptiness of her chest. It was a flicker of doubt, not in Julian's betrayal, but in Sophia's story. Julian was nothing if not thorough. A paternity test was exactly the kind of cold clinical failsafe he would install. Stipulation 3. Alistair continued, his voice relentless. Contingent upon the establishment of the trust, all assets and control of Beaumont Global will be managed by a board of trustees of which I am the chairman until the child reaches the age of 30. Ms. Laurent will be granted a generous annual stipend for her and the child's living expenses. She will hold no executive power, no voting shares, and will have no direct control over the company or its finances whatsoever. This time, Sophia could not hide her shock. Her jaw tightened and the color drained from her face. The dream of stepping into Julian's shoes, of wielding his power, had just been vaporized. She was to be a beneficiary, not a ruler. A well-kept figurehead. That's absurd, she snapped, her voice losing its soft, mournful quality and taking on a sharp, shrewish edge. Julian wanted me to be his partner. He trusted my judgment. His final written instructions state otherwise. Alistair replied coolly, not looking up from the page. Which leads to the final and perhaps most pertinent clause. Stipulation 4. He paused and looked directly at Sophia, his gaze steady and penetrating. Effective immediately upon the reading of this will I have authorized the executor of my estate, that is myself, to initiate a full and comprehensive forensic audit of all my personal and corporate accounts for the preceding 36 months. This audit will specifically investigate any and all financial transfers, gifts, wire transactions, and credit expenditures made to or for the benefit of Ms. Sophia Laurent. Sophia froze, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Alistair went on, his words precise and devastating. The purpose of this audit is to identify any evidence of fraud, misrepresentation, or manipulation. The will explicitly states, and I quote, "Should this audit reveal that Ms. Laurent has deliberately misled me regarding the nature of our relationship, her personal circumstances, or most critically, the paternity of her child, it will be considered a material breach of trust. In the event of such a finding, all clauses pertaining to Ms. Laurent and the Laurent Beaumont Legacy Trust are to be rendered void regardless of the outcome of any future DNA test." The trap had been sprung. It was brilliant, cruel, and utterly Julian. He hadn't just suspected her. He had built an inescapable legal cage around her. The will wasn't a love letter to his mistress. It was a posthumous interrogation under oath. Isabella stared at Alistair, her mind reeling. The pieces were clicking into place with dizzying speed. The public drama Ethan had called sloppy and not his style suddenly made sense. Julian hadn't caused it. He had anticipated it. He knew Sophia would make a public claim, and he had set a snare of spectacular proportions. Sophia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "This is an insult, an invasion of my privacy. You can't. I won't allow it." "You have no choice," Ms. Laurent, Alistair said calmly. "These are not suggestions. They are the legally binding terms set forth by the deceased. The audit has in fact already begun. The preliminary team was engaged the moment I received confirmation of Julian's death." The blood drained completely from Sophia's face. She looked cornered, a predator suddenly finding herself in a hunter's sights. Her eyes darted from Alistair to Isabella, a wild, desperate look replacing her earlier smugness. But Alistair wasn't finished. He turned to the final page of the will. "There is one last provision," he said, his voice softening slightly as his gaze fell upon Isabella. "It is a default clause to be enacted only if the Laurent Beaumont Legacy Trust is dissolved for any of the reasons previously stated." He looked at Isabella, a flicker of what might have been sympathy in his old tired eyes. "In such an event, the will states, all assets, properties, investments, and controlling interests in Beaumont Global designated for the aforementioned trust shall instead be transferred in their entirety and without condition to a new trust. This trust shall be named the Beaumont Family Legacy Trust. Its sole beneficiaries will be my beloved wife, Isabella Beaumont, and our legitimate and true heir, our son to be born of her." The room spun. Isabella gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Beloved wife. Legitimate and true heir. The words were a balm on a gaping wound. It wasn't a dismissal. It was protection. The $5 million in the cottage weren't a payoff. They were a safety net, a provision to ensure she was cared for in the interim while the trap closed on Sophia. He had known. Julian had known he was being played, and from beyond the grave he had orchestrated his final ruthless and brilliant move. He had used his will not to reward his mistress, but to utterly and completely destroy her, while simultaneously safeguarding the future of the one person who truly carried his legacy. Sophia Laurent stared at Isabella, her green eyes filled not with triumph, but with pure, unadulterated hatred. The war was not over, but the decisive battle had just been fought, and the victor was not who anyone had expected. The aftermath of the will reading was like a controlled demolition. Sophia Laurent, stripped of her smug certainty, fled Alistair Finch's office, in a fury refusing to speak to the press that had mysteriously been tipped off and were waiting for her downstairs. Her panicked, No comment was a stark contrast to the serene interviews she had given just days before. For Isabella, the world had been reconfigured. The grief for her husband remained, but it was now colored by a profound, complicated sense of awe. He had been distant, unfaithful, and emotionally unavailable, yet in his own cold, calculating way, he had fiercely protected her and their son. He hadn't trusted her with the truth while he was alive, but he had armed her with it after his death. It was the most Julian Beaumont act imaginable. Ethan, vindicated and energized, immediately set his own investigation into high gear, working in parallel with the official forensic audit commissioned by Alistair. "We're not waiting for the accountants to find the breadcrumbs," he told Isabella. "We're going to find the whole damn loaf." The unraveling of Sophia Laurent happened with breathtaking speed. The first thread to be pulled was financial. Alistair's auditors, a notoriously discreet and relentless firm from Zurich, were merciless. Within a week, they uncovered a systematic siphoning of funds. Julian had given Sophia a lavish allowance and access to a credit card for living expenses. She had been using it to funnel money into offshore accounts under a different name, Sophia Dubois, her birth name, which she had legally changed 2 years prior. She had been building a nest egg, preparing for an exit. But the transfers weren't the most damning discovery. The audit uncovered regular substantial payments to a man named Dr. Marcus Thorne. He wasn't a reputable obstetrician from a Park Avenue clinic. He was a disgraced doctor who had lost his license for selling fraudulent medical documents. Ethan's team, working from that lead, descended on Thorne's shabby office in a Queens strip mall. Faced with the threat of federal fraud charges, Dr. Thorne sang like a canary. He confessed to providing Sophia with a complete set of falsified medical records, sonograms, blood tests, due dates, all carefully crafted to mirror Isabella's pregnancy timeline. He had been coaching her on how to mimic pregnancy symptoms, what to say to her new high society friends. The most shocking revelation was that Sophia was pregnant, but the conception date on her genuine hidden medical records was from a time when Julian Beaumont was verifiably on a different continent. "She played him from the start," Ethan told Isabella, pacing the study in the Greenwich mansion. "She found out you were pregnant and saw her opening. She knew Julian wanted an heir more than anything, so she got pregnant herself by some other guy and sold Julian a story about a miracle baby, their secret love child. The other guy was the final piece of the puzzle. Digging into Sophia's life before she became Sophia Laurent, Ethan's investigators found him a handsome, struggling actor named Leo. The offshore accounts Sophia had been building were in both of their names. Their plan was audacious and simple. Sophia would secure the Beaumont fortune through her son, divorce the father of her child, and then after a decent period of mourning or settlement, she and Leo would reunite billions of dollars richer and live happily ever after. The evidence was a mountain, irrefutable and damning. Alistair Finch compiled the findings into a thick, damning report. He arranged a final meeting. It was held in the same boardroom as the will reading. This time Isabella sat at the head of the table. She was no longer the fragile, grieving widow. A new strength radiated from her, a calm, steely resolve. She was the queen, reclaiming her throne. Sophia was escorted in by 2 of Alistair's junior lawyers. She looked haggard, the designer clothes hanging on a frame that had lost weight from stress. The pregnancy prosthesis she had occasionally used to enhance her belly for photos was gone, and while still pregnant, she looked smaller, diminished. Her defiance was gone, replaced by a sullen, bitter resentment. Leo, her accomplice, was nowhere to be seen. Ethan's team discovered he had already fled the country the moment the audit was announced. Alistair didn't waste time with pleasantries. He laid out the evidence piece by damning piece. The fraudulent medical records, the bank statements from the offshore accounts, the sworn affidavit from Dr. Thorne. The flight records, proving Leo, not Julian, was with her at the time of conception. The forensic audit has revealed a clear and calculated pattern of fraud. Ms. Laurent, Alistair concluded, his voice cold as ice. "You have breached the terms of the will in the most egregious manner possible. As per Julian Beaumont's explicit instructions, any and all provisions for you and the child you carry are hereby null and void. You are disinherited." Sophia stared at the document spread on the table, her face a mask of disbelief as if she couldn't comprehend how her perfect plan had crumbled so completely. "He loved me," she whispered, the words sounding hollow and pathetic even to her own ears. "He knew. I know he did. He wouldn't do this." Isabella spoke for the first time, her voice clear and steady, cutting through Sophia's delusion. "No, Sophia. He didn't love you. He tolerated you. And then he figured you out. You weren't his great love. You were his final business transaction. And he made sure you were the one who paid the price." In that moment, Isabella finally understood the cold, brilliant, and heartbreakingly distant man she had married. Julian didn't operate on love. He operated on logic, loyalty, and legacy. Sophia had threatened his legacy. In his eyes, that was a betrayal far worse than simple infidelity. Sophia finally broke. A strangled sob escaped her lips, a sound of pure selfish rage at being outplayed. She stood up, knocking her chair over. "You think you've won?" she spat at Isabella, her eyes wild with hate. "You're still the woman he cheated on. You'll sleep in his bed and run his company, but you'll always know you weren't enough." Isabella met her gaze without flinching. "And you'll always be the woman who was nothing more than a footnote in a cautionary tale. Get out." Defeated and exposed, Sophia Laurent was escorted from the building, walking away from a life she had come so close to stealing. She left with nothing but the clothes on her back and the impending consequences of federal fraud charges, which Alistair's firm was pursuing with vigor. The serpent had been cast out of the garden, leaving Isabella alone to finally truly claim her inheritance. The weeks following Sophia's spectacular fall from grace were not quiet, but they were orderly. The chaos had been replaced by a focused, deliberate rebuilding. For Isabella, it was like stepping out of a darkened room into the full glare of the sun. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust, but soon she could see everything with a piercing newfound clarity. The oppressive weight of Julian's secrets had been lifted, and in its place was the colossal, intimidating, and yet exhilarating weight of his entire empire. Her first major challenge was the board of directors at Beaumont Global. They were men of Julian's generation, silver-haired, clad in bespoke suits, and steeped in a corporate culture of aggressive, relentless growth. They had viewed Julian with a mixture of fear and reverence and saw Isabella as little more than a tragic, beautiful footnote who would, they assumed, serve as a figurehead while they ran the company. They were profoundly mistaken. She called her first board meeting 2 weeks after the will reading. She walked into the boardroom on the 80th floor, the same intimidating space where her life had been torn apart and then pieced back together, not with the hesitant grief they expected, but with a serene, unshakable composure. She didn't take Julian's seat at the head of the table. Instead, she chose a chair midway down, a subtle but clear message that this was not a continuation of the old reign, but the beginning of something new. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice calm and measured, carrying easily across the cavernous room, "I know many of you are concerned about the future of Beaumont Global. You are wondering about continuity, about stability. Let me be clear. I have no intention of being my late husband. His genius for acquisitions and ruthless expansion was singular. Attempting to mimic it would be a disservice to his memory and a disaster for this company." A wave of relief followed by renewed uncertainty washed over the faces of the board members. However, she continued, her gaze sweeping over each of them, where Julian's focus was on relentless growth. "Mine will be on sustainable legacy. His strength was in building an empire. Mine will be in ensuring it's an empire worth leaving to our children." She then proceeded with methodical precision to outline a 3-point plan that addressed the company's most glaring weakness, its abysmal public image and high employee turnover, a direct result of Julian's cutthroat internal policies. She proposed a new corporate responsibility initiative, a complete overhaul of employee benefits, and the establishment of an innovation lab focused on green technology, a sector Julian had always dismissed as sentimental nonsense. She wasn't just quoting talking points prepared by an advisor. She had done her homework, citing their own internal reports and market analysis to support her vision. The men in the room who had arrived expecting to manage a grieving widow found themselves facing a shrewd, intelligent leader with a clear, well-articulated vision. By the end of the meeting, the skepticism had been replaced by a grudging, then genuine respect. She hadn't won them over with force, but with a quiet competence that was in its own way more formidable than Julian's overt aggression. With the company on a new steady course, Isabella turned her attention inward. She finalized the sale of the cold, imposing Greenwich mansion, feeling a profound sense of release as she signed the papers. Before moving into the elegant Upper East Side brownstone she had purchased, she took a weekend for herself, driving out to the Montauk cottage, the one property Julian had left her in that first seemingly cruel clause. The cottage was just as she remembered: weathered cedar shingles, a wraparound porch, the scent of salt and beach roses in the air. This was the one place where she had felt the unvarnished truth of their early love. Inside, she found an old photo album tucked away in a drawer. There they were, 10 years younger, smiling on the beach, the wind whipping her hair as Julian held her tight. He looked genuinely happy, a rare, unguarded glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with, before the weight of his own ambition had crushed the warmth out of him. Sitting on the porch, watching the waves crash against the shore, she finally allowed herself to grieve him properly. Not the corporate titan or the unfaithful husband, but the brilliant, complicated, and ultimately lonely man who had known he was being deceived and had concocted a plan of Byzantine complexity to protect the one thing he truly deemed his legacy, his legitimate child. She understood with a sorrowful clarity that the will was his version of a love letter. He couldn't say "I love you" or "I'm sorry," so he had written it in the language of codicils, stipulations, and trusts. It was heartbreaking, but it was also finally enough. She could forgive him. 2 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Isabella went into labor. In the quiet private room of the hospital, with Ethan by her side, she brought her son into the world. He was perfect, a healthy, beautiful baby with a shock of dark hair and his father's unmistakable steel-gray eyes. As the nurse placed him in her arms, Isabella looked into that tiny, searching face and felt a wave of love so fierce and protective it took her breath away. For a moment she considered naming him Julian, a nod to the man who had in the end secured his future. But looking at her son, she knew that wasn't right. This child would not be a carbon copy burdened by his father's complex legacy. He would be his own person. She decided to name him Arthur, after her own father, a man of quiet integrity and boundless warmth. He would carry the Beaumont name, but he would be raised with a different set of values: compassion, emotional honesty, and the understanding that true strength isn't about controlling others, but about empowering them. Her first major public appearance was not at a corporate gala, but at a press conference held in a modest community center. There, she announced the launch of the Beaumont Foundation for Women and Children, an organization dedicated to providing legal aid, financial support, and safe housing for single mothers and victims of financial and emotional abuse. The Beaumont name has long been associated with power, she said, her voice steady as she stood at the podium, holding Arthur securely in a sling against her chest. Today, we are redefining that power. It will no longer be the power to acquire, but the power to protect. It will be the power to lift up those who have been manipulated, deceived, or left vulnerable. This is not just charity. It is our new mission. The news made headlines, reshaping the public narrative from one of a scandalous affair to one of inspiring resilience. Ethan brought her the final update on Sophia Laurent a few months later. Facing insurmountable legal fees and federal fraud charges, Sophia had quietly accepted a plea deal. She had given birth to a daughter, but her maternal instincts were no match for her instinct for self-preservation. Overwhelmed and penniless, she had surrendered the child for adoption, and upon serving a short sentence disappeared completely, her name and story fading into a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. The news brought Isabella no joy, only a quiet sadness for the innocent child caught in the web of her mother's ambition. Years later, standing on the balcony of her brownstone, watching a 5-year-old Arthur chase leaves in the garden below, Isabella felt a profound and lasting peace. She was no longer just the billionaire's wife or the billionaire's widow. She was Isabella Beaumont, CEO, philanthropist, and mother. She had taken the shattered pieces of the life she'd been given and had built something stronger and more beautiful. Julian had left her a legacy of wealth and power, but she had transformed it into a legacy of truth, creating a new dynasty built not on the cold bedrock of ambition, but on the enduring foundation of a mother's unconditional love. The gilded cage was a distant memory. She was finally, truly free. Isabella's journey from a betrayed wife to a powerful leader is a raw and potent reminder that the greatest betrayals can sometimes forge the greatest strengths. It's a story about looking beneath the surface of a fairy tale life to find the complicated and often painful truths hidden there. Her story proves that true legacy isn't about the money you inherit, but the character you build when everything is on the line. She didn't just win a fortune. She reclaimed her life and redefined her future on her own terms. What did you think of Julian's ultimate plan? Was it a cruel act of revenge or a brilliant act of protection? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of intrigue, betrayal, and ultimate triumph resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a dramatic tale, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Brantley Blackwood, a titan of New York real estate, walked into his preliminary divorce hearing like a king entering his throne room. On his arm wasn't his lawyer, but his mistress, a stunningly beautiful and much younger woman named Cassandra Reed. It was a calculated act of cruelty, a power play designed to humiliate the wife he was casting aside after 20 years of marriage. He smirked at Galatea, expecting to see her crumble under the weight of his public betrayal. But he didn't truly see the woman across the aisle. He only saw a quiet, inconvenient obstacle to his new life. And he had no idea that the unassuming man sitting beside her, the one with the steel-gray hair and impassive expression, wasn't just any lawyer. He was Donovan Shaw, a legend in these halls, a man who had dismantled empires with nothing but a fountain pen and the unvarnished truth. The air in the back of the Rolls-Royce Cullinan was cool and smelled of Italian leather, and Cassandra's cloying perfume a custom blend from Le Labo that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Brantley Blackwood adjusted the cuff of his Brioni suit, the fabric a whisper-soft vicuña, and glanced at the woman beside him. Cassandra Reed was in his estimation perfection. Her blonde hair was a cascade of professionally managed waves. Her lips were full, her body sculpted by a personal trainer he paid for, and her eyes held a captivating mix of ambition and adoration. She was a living, breathing testament to his success. "Are you sure about this, Johnny?" she asked, her voice a practiced, breathy purr. She ran a perfectly manicured finger tipped with a 4-carat canary diamond he'd bought her last month along the lapel of his jacket. "Bringing me to court." Brantley chuckled, a deep rumbling sound of pure self-satisfaction. "It's not a trial, kitten. It's a preliminary hearing, a formality. It's to show Galatea that the world has moved on, that I have moved on." He looked out at the blur of Manhattan's Upper East Side. "She needs to see the new reality." "You are my reality now," Cassandra preened. This was exactly what she wanted to hear. At 26, she was a moderately successful social media influencer, her brand built on a carefully curated fantasy of luxury travel, high fashion, and effortless beauty. Brantley Blackwood wasn't just her lover. He was her ultimate content. Her ticket from the B-list to the stratosphere. His divorce was her coronation. "She'll be devastated," Cassandra said, feigning concern, while her mind calculated the potential for a viral story later. Surviving the drama with grace. It had a nice ring to it. She'll be realistic, Brantley corrected. My lawyer Gregory Adler is the best corporate man in the city. He says this is an open and shut case. The prenup is ironclad. She gets the house in Connecticut, the agreed-upon alimony for 5 years, and a nice little trust fund. She'll be comfortable. More than comfortable. But the empire Blackwood Estates is mine. It always has been. He believed it with every fiber of his being. He had built Blackwood Estates from a single scrappy development in Queens to a multi-billion-dollar portfolio of gleaming skyscrapers and luxury condominiums that reshaped the city's skyline. Galatea in his mind had been a passenger, a supportive, elegant, and ultimately replaceable part of his ascent. She'd raised their son, hosted his dinner parties, and decorated their homes. Important roles he'd concede, but not foundational. The foundation was his genius, his risk, his relentless drive. His phone buzzed. It was Adler. Brantley just checking in. We're all set for 10 a.m. I'll meet you on the courthouse steps. Remember the game plan. We're calm. We're reasonable. We're the picture of magnanimity. Don't worry, Greg, Brantley said, a smirk in his voice. I'm bringing a visual aid to demonstrate just how moved on I am. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Brantley, you're not talking about Ms. Reed, are you? I strongly advised against that. It's unnecessarily inflammatory. It gives her side ammunition. It's a power play, Greg. It shows I'm not afraid. It shows this is over. Galatea's lawyer is some no-name from a boutique firm. What's he going to do? Be offended. This whole thing will be wrapped up by lunch. He could almost hear Adler sigh through the phone. As you wish, Brantley. I'll see you there. Brantley hung up, annoyed by the lawyer's caution. Adler was a shark in the boardroom, but he didn't understand the art of personal warfare. This wasn't a negotiation over zoning permits. It was a conquest. Galatea had dared to contest the prenup, claiming material contributions to the business in its early years. A laughable assertion. He'd handled the finances, the deals, the vision. She'd chosen paint swatches and picked caterers. As the Cullinan purred to a stop in front of the New York County Courthouse at Foley Square, Brantley felt a surge of adrenaline. The press was already there. A few photographers, alerted by a tip he'd had his publicist discreetly plant, started snapping pictures as the chauffeur opened his door. He stepped out a titan in his prime and then turned to help Cassandra. She emerged like a movie star, her white Alexander McQueen dress, a stark angelic contrast to the grimy city steps. She slipped her hand into his, and they ascended the steps together, a tableau of new power and old money. He scanned the crowd for his wife. He didn't see her. Probably hiding, he thought. Probably afraid to face me. To face us. He felt a cold flicker of triumph. This was going to be even easier than he thought. While Brantley Blackwood was performing for the cameras, Galatea Blackwood was sitting in a quiet, book-lined office 30 blocks away, a cup of lukewarm tea held tightly in her hands. The office wasn't the sterile glass and chrome box favored by modern law firms. It was paneled in dark mahogany, the shelves overflowing with leather-bound legal texts and first-edition novels. It smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and quiet confidence. It was the office of Donovan Shaw. Galatea had found his name not through a glossy magazine's top lawyers list, but through a quiet recommendation from her father's old estate planner, a man who had been practicing law since the Nixon administration. You don't want a bulldog, he told her. Brantley will have a team of those. You need a ghost. Someone who dismantles the engine while the other side is still polishing the hood ornament. You need Shaw. Donovan Shaw was the antithesis of Brantley. Where Brantley was loud, Shaw was quiet. Where Brantley wore his wealth like a suit of armor, Shaw wore a simple, perfectly tailored but unassuming gray suit that seemed to have been his uniform for decades. He was in his late 60s with a full head of silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He didn't interrupt, he didn't offer false platitudes. He listened. For 2 hours during their first meeting, Galatea had talked. She spoke of the early years when Blackwood Estates was just a name on a piece of letterhead in their cramped 2-bedroom apartment. She described how she'd used her art history degree to identify up-and-coming neighborhoods, seeing the cultural potential that preceded gentrification. She detailed how she'd leveraged her social connections cultivated over years of charity work to introduce Brantley to the old money investors who wouldn't have given a brash developer from Queens the time of day. She recounted late nights spent poring over architectural plans, offering aesthetic suggestions that turned cookie-cutter condos into coveted properties. She wasn't just choosing paint swatches, she was shaping the brand's very identity. Brantley had been the engine, yes, but she had been the navigator and the designer, the one who gave his raw ambition a veneer of class and desirability. He had long since forgotten that. When she finished, Donovan Shaw had simply nodded. "He has forgotten that your contributions were not recorded on a balance sheet," he said, his voice calm and even. "Men like Mr. Blackwood often mistake the tangible for the valuable. Our job is to educate him, and the court." Now, on the morning of the hearing, he was reviewing a slim, leather-bound folder. "Gregory Adler is a fine corporate attorney," Shaw said, not looking up. "He is an expert at mergers, acquisitions, and hostile takeovers. He views this divorce as a corporate dissolution. He will focus on the prenuptial agreement as if it were a shareholder's contract." "And it isn't?" Galatea asked, her voice trembling slightly. Shaw finally looked up, his gaze direct but not unkind. "A marriage is a partnership, Mrs. Blackwood, not a corporation. The law in its finer moments recognizes that. Mr. Adler will argue the letter of the agreement. I will argue the spirit of the partnership and the facts of its dissolution." He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished desk. It was a list of financial transactions. "I engaged the services of a forensic accounting firm, Kroll Associates. They are the best. They have been tracing the flow of capital from Blackwood Estates for the past 18 months since your husband first met Ms. Reed." Galatea stared at the numbers. They were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled into a shell corporation named CR Creative Consulting. A lease on a penthouse at 733 Park Avenue paid for by the company. The purchase of a brand new Porsche Taycan registered as a company vehicle. A corporate American Express Centurion card, the mythical black card, with a monthly spend that eclipsed the annual salary of a city schoolteacher, all charged to a single user, Cassandra Reed. "He told me the business was having a tight year." She whispered the betrayal a fresh, sharp pain. "He said we had to cut back on our charitable donations." "Discrepancies of this nature are what we lawyers refer to as dissipation of marital assets," Shaw said calmly. "Or in layman's terms, he's been spending your money on his girlfriend." He closed the folder. "This is the first step. Today Mr. Adler will speak of contracts. We will speak of conduct." To fund this fight, Galatea had made a sacrifice. The week before, she had arranged a private sale through Christie's. The piece was a small, exquisite charcoal sketch by Edgar Degas d'Anceus Basculon, which she had inherited from her grandmother. It had hung in her private study for 20 years, a source of quiet joy. The proceeds from its sale were now funding Donovan Shaw and his team of accountants. She was converting her past into her future. "I saw on the news that he might bring her," Galatea said, the thought still a source of dread. Donovan Shaw stood and walked to the window, looking down at the bustling street. "Let him," he said. "Arrogance provides its own rope. All I have to do is let him use it." "Are you ready?" Mrs. Blackwood Galatea took a deep breath. The woman who had been terrified a month ago was gone, replaced by someone leaner, harder, more resolved. She thought of the Degas sketch of her grandmother's legacy of the 2 decades she had invested in a man who now saw her as a line item to be settled. "Yes, Mr. Shaw," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am." The atmosphere inside the New York County Courthouse was a chaotic symphony of controlled panic. Lawyers with worried expressions hurried down marble corridors, clients huddled in anxious whispers, and the air hummed with the weight of 1,000 private dramas being played out in public. For Brantley Blackwood, it was just another stage. He and Cassandra made their entrance into the hallway outside courtroom 4B with theatrical precision. His arm was possessively around her waist. his head held high, nodding curtly at the few people he recognized. He was a shark in his natural habitat, a world of power, intimidation, and high stakes. Cassandra, for her part, played the role of the devoted ingenue flawlessly, her expression a careful blend of supportive concern and unshakable confidence in her man. They were a spectacle, and they knew it. The whispers followed them like a wake. Gregory Adler met them near the courtroom doors, his face a mask of professional neutrality that barely concealed his deep disapproval. "Brantley," he said in a low, tight voice. "Ms. Reed." "Greg." "Ready for the fireworks!" Brantley boomed loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'd prefer a quiet, orderly proceeding," Adler muttered, shuffling his papers. "The judge is Annalise Keller. She's a stickler for decorum. No nonsense. By the book." "Don't worry," Brantley said, clapping him on the shoulder. "We'll be on our best behavior." Just then, the doors at the far end of the hall opened and Galatea Blackwood walked through. She was alone. There was no entourage, no nervous family members, no tearful best friend. She wore a simple, impeccably tailored navy Chanel suit, a piece of understated elegance that screamed old money and quiet dignity. Her hair was pulled back in a neat chignon and her face was composed, her eyes focused straight ahead. She wasn't just surviving the gauntlet of stares and whispers. She was ignoring it completely as if it were all beneath her notice. She walked directly toward them, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. Brantley's smirk widened. This was it. The confrontation. He prepared a condescending pleasantry, something to twist the knife. But Galatea's eyes never met his. Her gaze was fixed on a point just over his shoulder. She passed them without a word, without a flicker of acknowledgement, as if they were nothing more than statues in a hallway. It was a cut so deep and so clean, it left Brantley momentarily speechless. He had come here to humiliate her, and in a single silent gesture, she had rendered him and his beautiful mistress completely invisible. Following a few paces behind her was Donovan Shaw. He was carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked as old as he was. He saw Adler and offered a brief, polite nod. "Gregory," Shaw said, his voice even. "Donovan." Adler replied, his tone suddenly more formal, more respectful. "I wasn't aware you were handling this." "Mrs. Blackwood retained my services last month," Shaw said simply. A flicker of unease crossed Adler's face. He knew of Donovan Shaw. Everyone did. Shaw wasn't a flashy litigator who ended up on magazine covers. He was a lawyer's lawyer, a strategist who operated in the quiet, lethal depths of case law and financial discovery. He was the man you called when you didn't just want to win, you wanted to systematically dismantle your opponent's entire position until they had nowhere left to stand. Brantley, recovering from Galatea's public dismissal, hadn't noticed the shift in his lawyer's demeanor. "Is this the guy?" he whispered to Adler loud enough for Shaw to hear. "He looks like he should be retiring to Florida." Donovan Shaw's expression didn't change. He simply met Brantley's gaze for a brief second, and in that second, there was no anger, no intimidation, just a cold, clear assessment. It was the look a geologist gives a rock before taking a hammer to it. "All rise." The bailiff's voice echoed as the courtroom doors opened. They filed in. Brantley, ever the showman, guided Cassandra to a seat in the front row of the public gallery directly in Galatea's line of sight. He gave her hand a squeeze and a confident wink before taking his place at the plaintiff's table with Adler. Galatea and Shaw sat at the defendant's table. She stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, her posture perfect, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Judge Annalise Keller entered, a formidable woman in her late 50s, with sharp features and an air of permanent impatience. She sat and surveyed the room over her glasses. Her eyes briefly registered Cassandra in the front row, and a tiny, almost imperceptible frown creased her brow before vanishing. "We are here for the matter of Blackwood versus Blackwood, docket number 743B25. She began, her voice crisp. This is a preliminary hearing to address motions regarding the prenuptial agreement and temporary financial arrangements. Mr. Adler, you may begin. Adler stood smooth and confident once more. He launched into his prepared remarks, detailing the clear and unambiguous language of the prenuptial agreement. He painted Brantley as a generous man seeking a swift and amicable resolution, being unfairly held up by unreasonable demands. It was a solid standard and utterly predictable opening. Brantley leaned back in his chair, feeling the familiar thrill of control. Everything was going according to his script. He glanced over at Galatea. She remained impassive. He then looked at Cassandra, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. His kingdom was secure. His future was bright. Then Judge Keller said, "Thank you, Mr. Adler. Mr. Shaw, your response." Donovan Shaw rose to his feet. He didn't move to the lectern. He simply stood beside his table, his hands clasped behind his back. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing still and heavy with anticipation. "Your Honor," he began, his voice not loud but carrying to every corner of the room, "we are not here today to contest the existence of the prenuptial agreement." Adler and Brantley exchanged a look of surprise. This was unexpected. "We are here," Shaw continued, "to discuss the conduct of the plaintiff, Mr. Blackwood, which has not only violated the spirit of that agreement, but has also, we will argue, constituted a deliberate and systematic effort to defraud Mrs. Blackwood of her rightful share of the marital estate." A murmur went through the courtroom. Brantley sat bolt upright, his face darkening. Fraud. The word was an insult, an absurdity. "Objection, Your Honor," Adler snapped, jumping to his feet. "Counsel is making wild, unsubstantiated accusations. This is character assassination, not legal argument." Judge Keller looked at Shaw. "Mr. Shaw, you are making a very serious claim. You had better be able to back it up." Donovan Shaw gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I can, Your Honor," he said, opening the old leather briefcase. "And I intend to." The quiet confidence in Donovan Shaw's voice silenced the courtroom more effectively than a judge's gavel. Gregory Adler remained standing flustered while Brantley Blackwood stared, his face a thunderous mask of indignation. He had expected a legal skirmish, a debate over percentages and timelines. He had not expected a declaration of war. "Mr. Shaw," Judge Keller said, her voice dangerously level, "proceed. But be warned, I have very little tolerance for theatrics in my courtroom." "There will be no theatrics, Your Honor," Shaw replied, his tone deferential but firm. "Only facts." He pulled a single, precisely bound document from his briefcase. "Before we address the prenuptial agreement, I would like to file a motion to introduce evidence related to the significant and demonstrable dissipation of marital assets by the plaintiff beginning approximately 18 months ago." Adler was on his feet again. "Objection. The timeline is irrelevant. The prenuptial agreement clearly defines separate and marital property. My client's personal spending from his own accounts is his business." "Is it, Mr. Adler?" Shaw countered, his voice smooth as silk. "Is Blackwood Estates a privately held corporation in which Mr. Blackwood is the sole shareholder considered his own account? Or is it the primary marital asset, the value of which my client has a direct and vested interest in?" Judge Keller leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. "The source of the funds is Blackwood Estates, Mr. Shaw. Exclusively, Your Honor." "Objection overruled," the judge stated flatly, waving Adler back into his seat. "The court will hear the motion. Present your evidence, Mr. Shaw." Brantley felt a prickle of sweat on his brow. This was not the plan. Adler was supposed to be in control, quoting clauses from the prenup until Galatea's lawyer was buried in paperwork. Instead, this old man was changing the entire game, and the judge was letting him. Shaw didn't begin with a fiery accusation. His approach was far more devastating. It was methodical, clinical, like a surgeon making the first incision. He placed a document on the court's projector so the judge and the opposing counsel could see. "Your Honor, this is a copy of a lease agreement for the property at 733 Park Avenue, Penthouse B," Shaw began. The lease was signed 16 months ago. The lessee is Blackwood Estates. The monthly rent is $42,000. Brantley's blood ran cold. It was Cassandra's apartment. Mr. Blackwood, Shaw said, turning to face him for the first time. As the CEO of Blackwood Estates, can you tell the court what business purpose this residential penthouse serves for your commercial real estate company? Brantley looked to Adler, who gave a slight shake of his head. He was trapped. To lie would be perjury. To tell the truth would be an admission. It's used for entertaining potential investors. Brantley stammered the lie, tasting like ash in his mouth. A corporate apartment. I see. Shaw said, his expression unchanging. He put up a second document. This is the building's access log for the past 16 months, obtained via subpoena. The log shows only one key card has been consistently used for entry. That key card is registered to a Ms. Cassandra Reed. Can you tell the court what role Ms. Reed, an influencer by trade, plays in entertaining your investors? The room was utterly silent. Brantley could feel every eye on him. He could feel Cassandra's panicked gaze from the gallery. He could feel Galatia's quiet, steady presence at the other table. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the judge. She sometimes assists with hosting duties, he mumbled. The words sounded feeble, even to his own ears. Hosting duties that require her to be the sole long-term resident of a penthouse leased by the company. Shaw pressed his voice, still maddeningly calm. Objection! This is a fishing expedition. Adler cried out, his voice strained. It seems to me, Mr. Adler, that Mr. Shaw has already caught a fish, Judge Keller remarked dryly. Continue, Mr. Shaw. Shaw placed a third document on the projector. It was a vehicle registration form from the New York DMV. This is the title for a 2025 Porsche Taycan Turbo S. Purchase price $212,000. The vehicle was purchased by Blackwood Estates 3 months ago. It is registered as a company car for executive use. Yet according to GPS data from the vehicle's onboard system, also obtained via subpoena, the car's primary location, when not in use, is the private parking garage at 733 Park Avenue. And its daily commute, it seems, is between that address, the Equinox Gym on 74th Street, and various high-end boutiques on Madison Avenue. Shaw paused, letting the information sink in. Mr. Blackwood, as a matter of corporate governance, how does this use of a company asset contribute to the shareholder value of Blackwood Estates? Brantley's face was now a deep mottled red. The king was being questioned in his own throne room, and his crown was starting to feel very heavy. This wasn't a legal argument. It was a public vivisection. Shaw wasn't just attacking his finances. He was stripping away his dignity piece by meticulous piece. He shot a venomous glare at Galatea. She met his eyes for the first time that day. There was no triumph in her expression, no smug satisfaction. There was only a profound, weary sadness. It was the look of a woman who was not enjoying his destruction, but had simply accepted it as necessary. That look, more than anything Shaw had said, unnerved him to his very core. He had assumed she was fighting for money. He was just now beginning to understand that she was fighting for her life, for the value of the 20 years he had tried to erase. Shaw picked up another file. And now, Your Honor, he said, let's turn to the matter of a consulting firm named CR Creative Consulting LLC. Brantley felt a genuine bolt of fear. He knew what was coming next, and he knew with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty that there was absolutely nothing he or his high-priced corporate lawyer could do to stop it. The trap had been set months ago. He had just walked into it. The name CR Creative Consulting LLC hung in the air like a toxic cloud. For Brantley, it was the sound of his own carefully constructed world beginning to fracture. It was a shell company, a ghost entity. He'd had Adler's junior associate set up for the sole purpose of funneling tax-deductible business expenses to Cassandra without raising red flags on his personal accounts. It was supposed to be clever. It was supposed to be invisible. Donovan Shaw, however, was treating it like the star witness for the prosecution. CR Creative Consulting. Shaw repeated, his voice echoing slightly in the tense silence. Registered in Delaware, of course. A very popular state for such creative enterprises. Your Honor, before you are the articles of incorporation for this LLC. The sole registered agent and beneficiary is listed as Cassandra Reed. He turned his cool, analytical gaze back to Brantley. Mr. Blackwood Estates has been paying this consulting firm a monthly retainer of $50,000 for the past 14 months. That comes to a total of $700,000. Could you please enlighten the court as to the specific consulting services Ms. Reed has provided to your multi-billion-dollar real estate firm that would justify such a fee? Brantley's mind raced. He had coached Cassandra on this. It's for social media strategy, Johnny. Branding. Reaching a younger demographic. It had sounded plausible over champagne at Daniel. In the cold, harsh light of a federal courtroom, it sounded pathetic. Ms. Reed is a brand expert, Brantley said, forcing a confident tone he did not feel. She consults on marketing strategies for our newer luxury properties. Her expertise in the digital space is invaluable. Is it? Shaw asked, a hint of steel entering his voice. He gestured to a clerk who handed him a thick binder. This is a complete printout of Ms. Reed's entire social media output for the past 18 months. Her Instagram, her TikTok, her blog. We have analyzed every single post. He opened the binder. Over this period, Ms. Reed has mentioned Blackwood Estates or any of its properties exactly 0 times. She has, however, posted 73 pictures of herself on a yacht in St. Bart's, a trip paid for by the Blackwood Estates corporate card under the line item Caribbean Real Estate Scouting. She has posted 42 pictures from a wellness retreat in Aspen, also charged to the company. She has posted numerous unboxing videos of designer handbags, jewelry, and clothing, all purchased with funds that trace back to payments made to CR Creative Consulting. Shaw looked up from the binder, his eyes locking onto Brantley's. So I ask you again, Mr. Blackwood. What specific services, what reports, what marketing plans has Blackwood Estates received in exchange for the $700,000 it has paid Ms. Reed? We subpoenaed all records of communication, all work product from CR Creative Consulting. The return was a single one-page invoice each month with one line, consulting services. Nothing else. Gregory Adler was on his feet, his face pale. Your Honor, this is beyond the scope of a preliminary hearing. Mr. Shaw is trying to conduct a full-blown financial audit in open court. Mr. Adler, Judge Keller interjected, her voice sharp as broken glass. Your client is the CEO of a company that is the primary marital asset in this dispute. Mr. Shaw is presenting evidence that your client has been using that company as a personal slush fund to finance his extramarital affair. It is not only within the scope of this hearing, it is at the very heart of it. Sit down. Adler sat, his authority completely stripped away. He was a corporate lawyer who had walked into a bar fight and he was being pummeled. Brantley felt the walls closing in. The confidence, the arrogance that had been his armor for decades was cracking. He glanced into the gallery. Cassandra was no longer looking at him with adoration. She was staring at Donovan Shaw with wide-eyed terror. She was realizing, just as he was, that this wasn't just about his money anymore. This was about her money. The apartment, the car, the consulting fees, they were all being laid bare as the proceeds of a fraud. She was implicated. Shaw was relentless. He moved on, presenting evidence of a G-Wagon purchased for Cassandra's mother in Florida, a down payment on a beach house in the Hamptons for her brother, all funneled through the same corporate accounts. Each transaction was a hammer blow chipping away at the foundation of Brantley's empire. He was being portrayed not as a captain of industry, but as a common cheat, a man so blinded by a new lover that he would risk everything, bleeding his own company dry. The sum total of the funds diverted from Blackwood Estates to Ms. Reed and her family through direct payments, leases, vehicle purchases, and credit card expenditures, Shaw announced, his voice ringing with finality, comes to $4,872,000. He let the number hang in the air. Nearly $5 million in 18 months. Money, Shaw continued, turning to face the judge. That was part of the marital estate. Money that was earned during his 20-year marriage to my client. Money that rightfully belongs at least in half to Mrs. Galatea Blackwood. Brantley finally snapped. The humiliation was too much. The calculated destruction of his image was unbearable. This is ridiculous, he roared, slamming his hand on the table and rising to his feet. It's my company, my money, I built it, I can spend it on whatever or whoever I want. The outburst echoed in the stunned silence of the courtroom. It was a cry of pure entitled rage. It was also a complete and utter confession. Judge Keller stared at him, her face devoid of any emotion. Mr. Blackwood, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. You will sit down. You will be silent, or I will have the bailiff assist you. Slowly, his chest heaving, Brantley sank back into his chair. The mask was gone. The king was dethroned. For the first time, he looked not powerful but small. He risked a glance at Galatea. She was looking down at her hands, but he saw her shoulders shake once, a single silent sob of either grief or release. He couldn't tell which, and for some reason that was the most terrifying thing of all. The fallout from Brantley's outburst settled over the courtroom like a shroud. He had not only confirmed Shaw's allegations, but had revealed the raw, arrogant entitlement that fueled his actions. Gregory Adler looked as if he'd been physically struck, his entire case strategy shattered by his own client's lack of control. It was in this moment of stunned silence that the true nature of Donovan Shaw's reputation became clear. He wasn't just a good lawyer, he was a master of the judicial environment. He understood not just the law but the temperament of the court, and specifically the temperament of Judge Annalise Keller. Adler, trying to regain some semblance of control, rose shakily. Your Honor, in light of my client's emotional state, I request a brief recess to confer with him. Denied, Mr. Adler, Judge Keller said without hesitation. She then looked directly at Donovan Shaw. Mr. Shaw, you mentioned fraud. Dissipation of assets, however egregious, is one thing. Fraud is a criminal matter. The bar for that is exceedingly high. Here was the connection, the synergy that Brantley could never have anticipated. Judge Keller and Donovan Shaw were not friends. They did not socialize. But they were products of the same demanding old-school legal tradition. For years, Shaw had argued cases in her court, and before that in front of the senior judges who had been her mentors. She knew his work. She knew he did not use words like fraud lightly. He didn't bluff. When Donovan Shaw laid a card on the table, it was always an ace. I am aware of the bar, Your Honor, Shaw said calmly, and I am prepared to meet it. He produced his final set of documents. This is not just about lavish spending. This is about a concerted effort to hide and shield assets in anticipation of this divorce proceeding in direct violation of state and federal law. He placed the first folder on the projector. It was a series of wire transfer confirmations from the corporate accounts of Blackwood Estates to an entity called Blackwood Holdings International, based in the Cayman Islands. Over the last 6 months, Mr. Blackwood has transferred over $35 million of corporate funds to this offshore account, Shaw stated, an account that was conveniently omitted from his preliminary financial disclosures to this court. Brantley felt the floor drop out from under him. The offshore account was his ace in the hole, his secret war chest set up by an exclusive Swiss firm that had promised him absolute discretion. How could Shaw possibly know? The accountants at Kroll are remarkably thorough, Shaw said, as if reading his mind. They can trace the digital ghost of a single dollar through any firewall in the world, but they had help. He produced a second document. This is an affidavit signed and sworn from Mr. Albert Chin, former Chief Financial Officer of Blackwood Estates. Mr. Chin resigned 2 months ago. He states under penalty of perjury that Mr. Blackwood explicitly ordered him to make these transfers and to cook the books to disguise them as overseas investment capital. Adler shot to his feet. Objection. We were not made aware of this witness. He is not a witness, he is a whistleblower, Shaw corrected. And his affidavit was delivered to my office last week. He felt his own professional and legal liability was at risk due to Mr. Blackwood's actions. The air went out of Brantley's lungs. Albert Chen. Quiet, meticulous, loyal Albert. He had offered him a 7-figure severance package to keep him quiet. He never imagined the man's conscience or his fear of prison would outweigh the money. Now for the final killing blow. Shaw held up a single piece of paper. And finally, Your Honor, this is the financial disclosure form Mr. Blackwood signed and submitted to this court 3 weeks ago. It is a sworn statement made under penalty of perjury outlining his assets and liabilities. Shaw's voice dropped, becoming grave and heavy. On page 4, section B, under offshore holdings and foreign accounts, he has written the word none. He let the paper fall onto the table. That is not dissipation, Your Honor. That is not poor judgment. That is a deliberate, calculated lie to this court. That is perjury. That is fraud. The silence that followed was absolute. The word perjury echoed off the marble walls. It transformed the case from a messy divorce into a potential criminal proceeding. Brantley looked at his lawyer, his face pleading, but Adler was staring at the documents, his expression one of pure horror. He was a corporate attorney skilled in navigating hostile takeovers, not felony charges. He was utterly, hopelessly out of his depth. Then Brantley looked at Cassandra. The transformation in her was complete. The fear had been replaced by a cold, hard calculation. The dream of becoming Mrs. Blackwood, the queen of New York real estate, had evaporated. All that was left was the reality of being tied to a man who was not just losing his fortune but was facing potential jail time. Her consulting firm made her a co-conspirator, a recipient of fraudulent funds. She was no longer an asset, she was a liability. Her eyes darted towards the exit. Her posture shifted. She was detaching herself from him, severing the cord in her mind. He wasn't her golden ticket anymore. He was a sinking ship. Judge Keller looked down from her bench, her face grim. She looked at Brantley not with anger but with a kind of weary disappointment, the look of a judge who had seen greed and hubris destroy countless lives before. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "given the evidence presented by Mr. Shaw, evidence of asset dissipation, potential conspiracy to defraud and blatant perjury before this court, I am signing an immediate temporary order." She began to speak, and each word was a nail in the coffin of Brantley's life as he knew it. "I am freezing all personal and corporate assets of both Brantley Blackwood and Blackwood Estates pending a full and immediate audit by a court-appointed receiver. I am ordering the immediate repatriation of all funds held in the entity known as Blackwood Holdings International. A full injunction is in place preventing you from selling, transferring, or borrowing against any known asset. Your business and personal credit cards are hereby suspended. We will reconvene in 48 hours to discuss the appointment of the receiver and to address the matter of your untruthfulness with this court." She banged her gavel. "This hearing is adjourned." The final percussive crack of Judge Keller's gavel did not so much end the proceedings as shatter the illusion of civility that had thinly veiled the courtroom. The sound echoed sharp and absolute, and in its wake, chaos bloomed. Gregory Adler, his face the color of old parchment, lunged toward Brantley, his voice a frantic, desperate whisper. "Brantley, don't say another word. Not a word to anyone. We need to retain criminal counsel immediately. Perjury. Conspiracy to defraud. They can convene a grand jury." His words and those of the junior associates who swarmed the table like panicked ants were just noise. A distant buzzing static on the edge of Brantley's hearing. His world had shrunk to a pinpoint, a suffocating tunnel of vision focused on nothing at all. The judge's pronouncement replayed in his mind a torturous loop of incomprehensible phrases. Assets frozen. Court-appointed receiver. Repatriation of funds. Perjury. These were terms for other people, for criminals and failures he read about in the Wall Street Journal with detached pity. They were not words that could ever apply to him, Brantley Blackwood, the man who bent the city's skyline to his will. His body felt both immensely heavy and strangely disconnected, as if he were watching a movie of his own ruin. He needed an anchor, a familiar point in this swirling vortex of disaster. His eyes, wide with a dawning animal fear, darted to the gallery. He searched for the cascade of blonde hair, for the reassuring sight of the beautiful woman who was the symbol of his new life, the very reason for this entire ordeal. He scanned the front row, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs with a new, more primal terror. The seat beside the aisle, the one Cassandra had occupied, was empty. She hadn't waited for the chaos to peak. The moment the gavel had fallen, a switch had flipped in her mind. It was a cold, clean, and utterly unsentimental calculation. The asset Brantley had become a liability. The future she had been meticulously curating, First Lady of Blackwood Estates, had been foreclosed. While all eyes were on the judge and the crumbling man at the plaintiff's table, Cassandra Reed had risen with the fluid grace of a cat. She hadn't run. She had simply walked her pace, measured her expression, a blank mask of neutrality, down the aisle and out the heavy oak doors, before anyone even noticed she was gone. Her survival instinct, honed in the ruthless world of influencing and sugar daddy dating, was flawless. The show was over, and it was time to exit the stage before the set collapsed on top of her. Brantley didn't know this, of course. He only knew the crushing finality of that empty seat. He shoved himself to his feet, a strangled sound escaping his throat, pushing past Adler's restraining hand. "Cassandra?" He mumbled, his voice hoarse. He stumbled away from the table, away from the frantic legal advice and the pitying stares, and lurched into the marble corridor. The hallway was a cavern of echoes and whispers. He saw a clerk look away, a bailiff shake his head slowly. He was no longer a titan to be feared or respected. He was a spectacle, a man stripped bare in the public square. The corridor was empty. The Rolls-Royce and his loyal chauffeur would be waiting outside, a ghost of a life that was no longer his to command. But the woman he had brought to flaunt as his prize was gone. His hands shaking, he pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb fumbling to find her contact. He had to hear her voice, had to have her tell him this was all a nightmare. As the screen lit up, a notification banner appeared at the top. An Instagram update. Cassandra Reed just added to their story. With a trembling finger, he tapped it open. There was no picture of them, no defiant message of support. It was a simple black screen, the kind used for solemn announcements. In the center, in a delicate, serene font, were the words, "Sometimes you have to walk away to protect your own peace and integrity. Onwards and upwards." The platitude, so vapid and generic, was more brutal than any curse. It was a press release for her soul. She was already distancing herself, rebranding his collapse as a toxic environment she was bravely escaping. In the space of an afternoon, he had been demoted from a king to a footnote in her journey of self-discovery. A deep, guttural sound of pure agony tore from his throat. He leaned against the cold marble wall, the phone slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. At the far end of the same corridor, Galatea Blackwood emerged from the courtroom. She did not rush. She walked with a quiet, deliberate grace, as if measuring each step into her new reality. The perpetual tension that had lived in her shoulders for years, a constant, unwelcome companion, had finally dissolved. A profound, bone-deep weariness remained, but it was overlaid with the first stirrings of an unfamiliar lightness. Donovan Shaw was beside her, his worn leather briefcase held loosely in one hand. He had not gloated or offered a triumphant smile. He had simply packed his papers, a craftsman putting away his tools after a difficult job well done. He navigated her through the throng of reporters now gathered outside the doors, his presence a shield of quiet authority. "The court-appointed receiver will be fair but thorough," Shaw said, his voice a calm anchor in the turbulent aftermath. "They will unwind what he has done. It will take time, but the end result will be a just one. The initial injunction gives us all the leverage we need." Galatea nodded, looking not at the clamoring press, but through the grand courthouse windows at the sunlit expanse of Foley Square. "It was never just about the money, Donovan," she said, her voice steady. "You know that. It was about the truth. For 2 decades, I poured myself into that life, that company. He tried to erase all of it. He tried to make me invisible, a ghost in my own history." "I do not think," Shaw replied, the corner of his mouth twitching in the barest hint of a smile, "that anyone in that courtroom today found you to be invisible, Mrs. Blackwood." For the first time that day, a genuine, unburdened smile touched Galatia's lips. It reached her eyes, which for months had been clouded with worry and betrayal. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying the weight of all her gratitude. "For everything." He gave a simple, respectful nod. It was all that was needed between them. His work would continue, but the battle, the one for her dignity, was over. Galatea walked out of the courthouse alone and stepped onto the top of the wide stone steps. For a moment she was blinded. The bright, unfiltered afternoon sun was a physical shock after the dim, wood-paneled solemnity of the court. She paused, lifting a hand to shield her eyes, and took a deep, clean breath. It was the first breath she'd taken in 18 months that didn't taste of anxiety. She had spent so long in the colossal shadow of Brantley's ego, learning to navigate the darkness of his moods and eventually his cruel betrayal. Now, standing on these steps, she felt the warmth on her face, heard the distant siren, the rumble of a subway beneath her feet, the cacophony of 1,000 lives intersecting in the city square. The world hadn't stopped for her drama. It had been waiting. She didn't look back at the grand building or the man whose life was imploding within its walls. There was no triumph in his ruin, only a deep, profound sorrow for the man he used to be and the marriage they had lost long before Cassandra ever appeared. Her victory wasn't over him. It was for herself. She looked forward down the steps at the endless river of New York City life flowing before her. She didn't know exactly what her future held, a smaller home perhaps, a return to the art world she'd left behind, a quiet life of her own making. The details were unwritten, but for the first time in a very long time she held the pen. The future was a blank page, and it was hers. And it had just begun. In the end, Brantley Blackwood's empire wasn't brought down by a market crash or a rival developer, but by his own breathtaking arrogance and the quiet resolve of the woman he so carelessly underestimated. Galatea Blackwood didn't fight fire with fire. She fought it with cold, hard, undeniable fact, proving that the truth, when wielded by a master, is the most powerful weapon of all. This story is a powerful reminder that the loudest person in the room is not always the strongest, and that true strength doesn't need to announce its arrival. It proves itself in the final act. If you are captivated by Galatea's journey from betrayal to triumph, please show your support for stories like this. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see that justice can prevail, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales of shocking twists and ultimate vindication. What did you think of Cassandra's final move to abandon Brantley? Was it cold-blooded or simple survival? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one.